Good morning. Welcome to Sports Radio 1310, The Ticket. George DiGianni, Train Station Fitness Show at 7:01 in the morning. And I'm bringing a show to you today, if you didn't hear the promo during the week, that has nothing to do with fat loss. I guess in an indirect way, there possibly could be some consequences. But I'm bringing a show to you today. If you're a parent, you intend to be a parent, you know you have some friends who are parents, and you recognize behavior in a child that we think is normal, which at the end of this show you may say, well, big deal, this is all normal and we shouldn't do anything about it, or maybe there are things we should or could do about it. And so what I'm discussing today is childhood depression, adolescence depression. And you say, well, George, this is really not a big deal for me. Why do I care about this right now in my life? My kids are older, I don't have kids, I don't care. I think it's important because if you look at how society treats people with a quote-unquote condition, there are times in our lives where we are not as happy. Maybe we don't have the greatest sexual drive because we're so focused on whatever we're doing in our lives in business. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but do you need Viagra? If you're a little depressed because there's a death in your family, you're going through a divorce, isn't that normal? If you're a child, you're not liked at school, you're bullied, isn't that normal that you feel depressed? Do we have to treat this with medication? Do we have to look at this as a condition and say, oh my God, your child's depressed, here's what we need to do about it? And I don't think we need to look at these children and people in general and say, you have a condition. There's something wrong with you. Today my guest is Dr. Deborah Serrani, and she wants to look at childhood depression in a different way and also present some myths versus facts. I think one of them will be very profound as far as the stats that we will read off to you, or maybe she'll share them with you, about the childhood depression in America, the alarming numbers that you may not recognize as being an issue. And so what we'll do is we want to have you look at your child's behavior, their moody behavior. Is it consistent? Is it chronic? And is it something to worry about? Is it normal part of development, or is it really depression? Do you recognize or even know what the signs of depression are in a child, in an adolescent? We'll discuss all of this coming up next with Dr. Deborah Serrani, 704 Sports Radio 1310, The Ticket.
Jesus skirts.
712 Sports Radio 1310, The Ticket, George DiGianni, Train Station Fitness Show. Today we're discussing the book by author Deborah Serrani. The book is Depression and Your Child, a guide for parents and caregivers. Now, before you go anywhere, you turn on the show and you're thinking, okay, what kind of tips am I going to get today? If you're not a parent, I don't want you going anywhere. Even if you're not intending to have children. This is important information because where we're going to go with this show is not one that should easily be dismissed because of the information or how we portray people in America, throughout the world, but mostly America, when we look at how to treat a specific condition and why we put conditions on people who may not have a condition. And so I want to talk more with my guest today, Dr. Deborah Serrani. Good morning to you.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me.
You are welcome. Thank you for coming on the show today. I like this show, and even though this is not a typical show for the Train Station Fitness Show, I like this because there were certain things that really frustrated me, and we'll get into those later. And there's some other points of this conversation that I had absolutely no clue about as far as the stats are concerned when it comes to the amount of children in America specifically that are labeled as clinically depressed, and I thought that was an amazing statistic. So I wanted you, one of the things that you sent me, Dr. Serrani, was your top 10 myths that surround pediatric depression and what you need to know that could save your child's life. And I thought that was a great title, because your first myth was that babies and children cannot be diagnosed with depression. You said that's actually false. Go ahead and elaborate on that if you would.
Well, you know, it was been a very long time for science to catch up with the truth that indeed children and babies can be depressed. And what research has found is that up to 1 out of 40 babies can be diagnosed with depression. And when it comes to kids, preschoolers, 4% of them can be clinically diagnosed, 5% of school-age children, those are kids between 8 and 10 years old. And then it doubles in adolescence, and it jumps up to 11% who are walking around with an untreated clinical disorder. And the issue here is that depression is treatable.
Well, before you go there, because you'll finish the show in 5 minutes, so let's build it up if you don't mind for a moment. In your first statement, you said be aware of age-specific behaviors and symptoms. So if we're talking about babies, or let's just stick with babies for a moment. Maybe I went too far, excuse me. Yeah, let's talk about babies for a moment. What are the signs or the symptoms of a baby who is depressed? How does a parent begin to recognize this?
Well, it starts with looking at the overall functioning level of a baby. And if you're a parent, or you know a parent, or you've seen a baby, you know that there are certain things that they're supposed to do, like they're supposed to cry, they're supposed to track their eyes, they're supposed to turn their head, they're supposed to be what we would call responsive and reactive. And what research has found in babies that are depressed are that they have often a very weak cry. They don't eat well. They don't sleep well. They're extra fussy beyond what we would think of as colic, because we see that their response levels, their sensory levels, are very dulled. And when we remove these babies, or we improve the parenting, we see that these babies recover. And it's truly a startling thing. I've actually held babies and evaluated babies who had these depressive symptoms, and you can actually feel the heaviness in their little bodies. It's quite amazing.
So we're blaming this baby's depression on parenting.
A part of it is, yes, the research suggests that parents who may be depressed cannot attend to their child, and so there's what we call a contagion that can happen with babies. And then there's also certain predispositions that babies may have, genetically speaking, that in time, their growth and their ability to thrive will improve. So it's a combination of nature and nurture, which is often the case in depression.
So you made a blanketed statement earlier and said, we know as a parent, babies are supposed to cry. We know they're supposed to track their eyes back and forth. And you said that about a few, I guess, facts about babies. I don't know that. And I think, I don't know how many times I've heard this by a new mother or parents where they say there's no book on this stuff. And I know there's a lot of books about it, but you're one day you're a single person and you're living your life a certain way. The next day you're a parent and you have to, all of a sudden, you're just supposed to know, and we just don't know. And I think for parents, when you have a new baby, it would be important for a specialist like yourself to say, here are the important factors to look at when you have a newborn baby, and if they don't exhibit crying, tracking, and whatever else you mentioned earlier, then it may be something to look into. There's not a specific condition necessarily, but how often are babies supposed to cry? There might be a silly question for you. I don't know.
Well, I'm not a physician or a pediatrician, but babies are supposed to cry. They cry to let you know when they're hungry. They let you know when they cry when they're cold. There's a communication style. But, George, I think you are making an excellent point, which is that something that would feel so easy to detect sometimes doesn't make an impression for the parents because they're just not aware of it.
Right, and then so my guess is that when the parent sees a child crying many times or more than they expect, look, I just changed your diaper, I fed you, you had a full night's sleep, why are you crying? They get frustrated, and then we know about, shaking baby syndrome and all that other stuff that they go, it's not syndrome, I don't know what it's called, I know it's shaking baby. But I think it's important for us to recognize what's normal behavior from a baby who can't talk to you and what's not normal. And then we go to now the pediatrician and tell the pediatrician, my baby or my child now is very moody. And most people would dismiss this as a child who is learning about life, that they're just moody. And you tend to disagree with that and say moodiness or this type of behavior might be attached to something much more serious. Is that correct?
Yes, most mental illnesses are not stages or phases that children move through. And it's unfortunate that sometimes the first doctor that a family or will see is a pediatrician who sometimes minimizes the experience because children are moody. Children, can be irritable. It is part of the experience. But as we'll talk, I'm sure, later, there are certain things that pediatricians and parents need to be mindful of, and these particular things help you identify when something is a stage and when something is far more serious.
So how does someone know how long to let the moodiness go? How long do you let it go for before you recognize it's not a stage? And please, if you will, even though these questions are out of order, please define what moodiness means. What does it look like?
Well, with any mental illness, a lot of the diagnostic categories get a lot of, a bad reputation because nobody likes to be classified or labeled. But the important thing about understanding classification is it does give us a set of symptoms that we can look at and tick off, and that helps us determine if a disorder is operating. When it comes to pediatric depression, a mood here or there, irritability here or there, and what I mean here or there, I mean something that's not chronic. When we see moodiness, irritability, crying, clinginess, withdrawal, isolation, kids who don't play with their toys, etc., lasting for 2 weeks or more, it's the duration of the time, George, the chronic length of these particular presentations that constitutes disorder and not a transient stage.
So it's about being aware as a parent to recognize when I think it may be easier for a parent who has one child because you're with that child all of the time and you're not only playing with the child, but you're just always with that child and you get to recognize the changes in behavior, where if you have 2 or 3 or more kids, it may be more difficult to pay attention to all of them, especially if they're in different rooms doing their own thing. And it may be hard to recognize when a child is ripping their toys apart to see what's on the inside and then can't put it back together. They don't care about it anymore, that this might be a behavior that is anger related or whatever else it would be. I'm not the psychologist, you are.
Right, and the piece here is that depression does not look like it does in adults. There is a very different presentation in children, and much like we've just talked about, sometimes pediatricians minimize what the parents are reporting, even though the parents know something's not right. They may not even realize that their child is depressed. They just know that he's not himself or she's not herself, and I'm concerned. We're pre-wired with these instincts that we have as parents, and a great deal of the time when I see a family, 9 out of 10 times I'm saying to the parents, you were spot on. You sense there was something not right.
We're here with Dr. Deborah Serrani. She wrote a book called Depression in Your Child, A Guide for Parents and Caregivers. Website is drdeborahserrani.com. It's DrDeborah Serrani. I know you didn't get all that, so the show will be loaded on my 21-day Facebook page later today. We talk about age-related behaviors. Is there some common denominator that you're able to share with people listening now that we can give specific age ranges, like a newborn to 2 years old, 2 years old to 5 years old, and so on, that we can look at as abnormal behaviors?
Yes. As we mentioned, with babies, there seems to be this overall under-functioning, this listlessness that depressed babies have. But as babies, depressed kids grow as toddlers, let's say the preschool ages, as adults, we are far more in touch with our thoughts and feelings, and depression presents very differently. But in these little ones, they can't make sense of their feelings and thoughts and the experience. So oftentimes, their depressive symptoms present behaviorally and physically. So they are often irritable. Children will often report aches and pains. They will be clingy, or just the opposite. They'll be withdrawing. They won't play with their toys. For school-age children, again, it kind of happens a little bit more, but of those things that we'll see, like physical complaints and things like that. But then difficulty focusing and studying. They can't do well in school. Sometimes these kids are kind of taken down the path of looking at a possible learning disability when really it's far more serious of a mental illness that's going on. And with adolescents, people typically think adolescents are moody, and yes, that's true to a large degree, but the depressed kid will often be very, very isolated and very, very withdrawn, sometimes to the point of not even seeking friends or going out with friends. So these are the kind of presentations that happen among different age groups, the common thread being that behaviorally speaking, we see some of the irritability, and physically speaking, we see a lot of aches and pains.
So let's discuss more of this here coming up next about children and depression. I want to help identify, for parents listening now, and even future parents, whether or not a certain behavior needs to be taken to the doctor in the first place. Are you overreacting? I'm sure there are people who overreact. Do they need a specific type of treatment? Do they really have this mental illness? It's such a sticky word. Who wants to be classified as having a mental illness? We'll talk more with Dr. Deborah Serrani coming up next. It's 726 Sports Radio 1310, The Ticket. Okay. It's 7:34 Sports Radio 1310, The Ticket. My guest is Dr. Deborah Serrani. She wrote a book called Depression and Your Child, a guide for parents and caregivers. And it's an enlightening show, regardless of your intention, your goal for your own health. But when we talk about being a parent to a child, a caregiver to a child, whether it's a baby or an adolescent, there are certain things we discussed already you can look at within your child to make sure they're not exhibiting certain behavior that is chronic that needs to have specific attention. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, Dr. Serrani, is what is the increase in child depression over the last 30 years, if you can give us some type of percentage of an increase? Dr. Serrani.
Yes, it's higher now than it's ever been before, upwards of 30% higher than it was about 30 years ago. And the reason being is that I think we're getting better at detecting it. And the other flip side is, sadly, I think that the world is filled with a lot of stress and difficulty for families. So we see that other piece kind of pressing on these little ones, making it hard for them to maybe cope with an illness that years earlier might have not been so difficult to do.
I see it as multifaceted, and I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the myths I wanted to share now that you mentioned in what you sent me, you said, talking about depression gives kids ideas and makes things worse, and you said that's false. It's actually really much better for your children, so you can identify it and help them through what they're going through. So go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
Well, a lot of schools and a lot of family programs get a little nervous when we bring the subject of talking about depression or suicide into the mix. They fear that, certain vulnerable kids will get ideas and maybe act out on them. But what science has found, and I love using science and research because I think it helps ground the reality for people, is that when we open the door and we talk about these very delicate and difficult issues, it actually makes kids say, I'm not alone, or wow, this is something that I can kind of help and fix. And it generally allows people to talk about their experiences and seek help. So, it is a tremendous myth that if we talk about it, we're going to make things worse. But that's not true at all. I
think what I find is that people already have communication problems as it is that are difficult. They don't know how to communicate about feelings. They don't know the right questions to ask. They don't want to do it. It's very hard. It's time to put our big boy and big girl pants up on and wake up and find out what the communication is that we need to have with our significant other, with our child. How are we going to raise a child? What are the things we're going to say? And I don't know what the suggestions are for a parent to begin to make the child feel safe to open up and say what they're feeling. I don't know what that is, and I'm sure that's a much longer conversation than what we have here on today's show.
Well, I think it's important to treat depression as a medical illness, a chronic illness. And, I know there's stigma attached to a lot of things related to mental illness because it's the last bastion of illness for us to fully accept. But, we would never place a stigma label on a child who has cancer or diabetes or a heart condition. And if we can take those treatment goals when kids get into treatment, we talk to the child about learning to live with your illness. And it doesn't have to be all of who you are. It's just a part of who you are. And if we're lucky enough to get in there early, we can actually derail the trajectory of depression. A lot of kids can move towards actually remission and never have another experience again. So that's why a book like mine or shows like this that allow us to kind of open the door on this subject are really, really helpful.
Some profound stats I want to share with everyone. Suicide is the third leading cause of death in adolescents age 15 to 24. Here's a kicker for you. And it is the sixth leading cause of death in children ages 5 to 14. Seriously, a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old is contemplating suicide and they're getting away with it?
Oh, sure. We see this often. We see children who just unbuckle their seatbelt and open the car door and allow themselves to fall out. We see children running into the streets. We see little ones, taking medicine. It's actually very startling when you think about the grip that depression has on these children. They're kids. You say, what do kids have to be sad about? But that's the piece to depression. It doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care how many toys you have or where you live or anything like that. It's a disease that really changes how you think and feel to the point where suicide becomes a possible choice. It almost sounds reasonable. But people who are depressed aren't thinking well. So, yeah, these stats are very, very frightening.
So I want to look at, this to me is the most critical piece of the show as far as what I'm concerned and what I'm about to mention now. We don't have a lot of time for it. We'll get into it now and maybe we can finish up with it on the last segment. One of the myths you talk about is how people say antidepressants will change your child's personality, and you said antidepressants actually normalize the range of moods in children who have a mood disorder and will not change their personality. Another myth, once a child starts taking antidepressant, they're on it for life, and you say no, it could be about a year for them to have this change. And I'm moving through this quite fast. Give me just a synopsis, if you will, so we can really get into the meat of this topic about where you stand with antidepressants.
Well, I'm a psychologist, so I'm a talk therapist, and medication for me, when I'm working with children, is a last resort. I like to use a lot of other things besides the talk therapy skills that are grounded in science. I use a lot of holistic aspects, from bright light therapy to eating better foods, using melatonin, sleeping better. There's lots of things people can do to help their child that has nothing to do with classical, traditional medicine. But if there's a child that once we go through all of these other steps and it's not successful, it means that their depression is usually of a serious level. And what we know from research is that the neurochemistry of the antidepressants helps the brain to function better. And it can be very scary. And in the news, we hear all these terrible stories, and parents worry, is my child going to go on a shooting spree, or is my child going to become suicidal on the medication? Those are very rare cases. They exist nonetheless. But if you're watchful and you have a great team of doctors working with you, using medication and using it wisely and slowly and appropriately will allow you to bypass all of those scary things you sometimes read about.
And so you may be the first line of defense for someone to evaluate whether a child needs to be put on this, because I want to go off on a rant for a moment. When we talk about SSRI drugs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, this is what people use when they have some type of what they call chemical imbalance of serotonin. Well, studies have shown in the Journal of American Medical Association that these SSRI drugs, Praxil, Prozac, and the like, are no more effective in treating depression than a placebo pill, but
That's true, but only in mild depression, George. Not
well, this is, but I'm like I said, I'm going off on a rant, so get mad at me in a moment. But the studies have shown, and we've discussed this on this show. This is not the first time we've discussed depression on this radio show. We've done it many, many times. But what I've seen in my research and talked with other doctors about is that these drugs only work, they're only effective for severe cases of depression. They have no effect whatsoever other than placebo on anybody who has normal or mild or moderate depression. And this is the research we found.
This is very true. This is why medication for children should be a last resort, and it's not a first step, and it's not something to be entered into just casually. And placebo, the JAMA study was a life-changing, pharmaceutical-changing study. And but it is important, to understand the range of illness. Mild depression and moderate depression, you can do well without the medicine.
Right, and I want to discuss that coming up in the next segment. We are over-medicating everyone. Medication doesn't make you healthy. It makes you less healthy. It does not make you healthy. Acute symptoms and medication are a godsend. Chronic medication is detrimental to our health. So anything that robs us of nutrients, such as poor food, any type of stress, medication is stress on a chronic level, we've got to replace those nutrients to help even make the medication work better and also help eliminate symptoms or minimize them. The brain in a living person is not able to be measured about the level of serotonin we need. We don't know what the levels are, what high levels are, or low levels are. We know that serotonin in people who have high levels of serotonin, even though they could be all happy, can be depressed. We know people who have low levels of serotonin can not have any depression whatsoever. So who the hell are we to decide on who needs these SSRI drugs? And it comes down to what we've seen in these studies, that it's the people with severe issues that will benefit the most. What we found, to finish this up because we have to get to a break, and I do want to discuss this more, is that the FDA gave a black box warning, which is the most serious type of warning that prescription drug labeling can receive, noting that children and adolescents that are using these antidepressive drugs should be closely monitored for any worsening depression, emergence of suicidal thinking or behavior, or unusual changes in behavior, sleeplessness, agitation, withdrawal from normal situations like you already mentioned, and I praise you for this. I have a novel idea coming up next, Doc, and it's something that most people don't consider. And you might think I'm way out there for saying this, but I love living on the edge. I want to share it with you coming up next. It's 746 Sports Radio 1310, The Ticket. 755 Sports Radio 1310, The Ticket. George DiGianni, Train Station Fitness Show. Discussing with my guest today her book, Depression in Your Child, A Guide for Parents and Caregivers, Dr. Deborah Serrani. Thank you for joining us again. So I have this, there are several times you wanted to interject earlier. I didn't let you do it on purpose. I wanted to finish my thought, plus we had to go to a break. What did you want to say?
So much, so why don't you continue?
No, because mine is more closing remarks than anything else, so we only have a couple of minutes, so go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that, there are tests now, genetic tests that can actually measure the level of serotonin. A lot of people aren't aware of it, and it's covered by Medicare and insurance companies. So that's a nice way to kind of, before you start taking any kind of medication or alternative medicine approach, to understand what your serotonin levels are. So that's.
But hold on one second. We don't know normal serotonin levels. That's the whole point of my argument. Who are you to put, not you necessarily, who is somebody to put someone on a medication for raising their serotonin if they're low, when we know that people who have low serotonin are not depressed, but people who have high serotonin can be?
These genetic tests measure what is appropriate for you and what your CYP enzyme rates are. It's very, very complicated. It's very cutting edge. It may be something that if I send you a link, you might find really fascinating, but they are getting more personalized in understanding how and which and why certain medications should and should not be used based on your own genetic makeup. It's really cool.
So I would like for you to send that, and I've been doing a lot of research on that topic lately. Do you know what introns are?
No, I don't.
Okay, so introns are what make that genetic that DNA, and it's what makes the gene. And what people tend to think they accept as gospel as that once their genes are set a certain way, that's who they are for the rest of their lives, and that's actually not true. Introns influence the gene. Introns were thought as the junk gene after they created this, if you will, and it's not true. Those introns now have the ability to influence the gene in a certain way, which is to say, through lifestyle, you have the ability to change the expression of that gene. If you're predisposed to be obese, you don't have to be. You could be one of the fittest people on the planet. If you're predisposed to have diabetes, doesn't mean you have to have it. It's not inevitable. You have this ability to change that expression, and so there are three outcomes of each gene. We know that for a fact. You can be in one extreme, if you will, another extreme, or you could be in the norm. And you can change that. And so that's the thing that frustrates me more than anything. Not with drugs, by the way, because I agree with you. Certain people need, well, we can tell whether certain drugs will work for certain people based on their genetic makeup of how they are today. I love that. It is the best medicine, if you will, to come out in a long time, if ever. Because who are we to put somebody on any drug without first testing them? And I love that. But what I don't want people accepting as gospel, if you will, is that just because our genes say we are something means that we have to live with that impression that that's who we are for the rest of our lives. It doesn't have to be that. And that's my hope, to change that here in the future. That's my goal.
That sounds like a great goal.
It is, and it's something that I think it would be good for you as well to look into as a doctor, to recognize these introns can influence genes, and people don't have to accept certain parameters in their life. What I was looking at making a comment about is, you and I recognize, people who are logical recognize that most people, let's stick with children specifically for the show, are watching too much darn TV. They're on their computer too long. They now have cell phones. They're eating a lot of sugar. Oh, by the way, they're not exercising enough, so they're fat. And that's all these variables, in my opinion, is the number one catalyst to why we're seeing heightened, quote-unquote, conditions with children, depression being one of them. It's not just how they're being raised in the family, if they're getting bullied in school and dealing with normal children or challenges of life. It's all of these other factors that we're not taking inventory of and being accountable as parents. And that's what I wanted to close on. You have about 30 seconds. Go ahead and comment, please.
I think that you're right. I think long ago, the days of running outside are we don't see that anymore. There's something about old school that actually would be more healthy for our kids in more ways than one. So I think you're making an excellent point.
Dr. Deborah Serrani, fantastic guest today. You're a sweetheart. Loved having you on. And good luck with your book. Have a great day.
Thank you, and thanks again for the invite.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.